BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. This episode of Black Box Online Radio is brought to you by Rep Sports and Raze Energy. Are you a fan of energy drinks, protein shakes, and health foods? Well, I sure am. I use the stuff almost every single day. They sell Raze Energy products at my local gym, but you can have them shipped to your home. Use the coupon code NED075, that's NED075, for discounts applied at the checkout. The link is in the description box. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the show. Today I actually had a different topic scheduled to discuss with you guys, but I noticed that a lot of news outlets were reporting on some recent developments involving the case of Sherri Papini, a woman who went missing in 2016 and may have possibly staged her own disappearance and then return from her alleged abductors. And throughout this episode, I would like to talk about how this case could be connected to some other true crime cases, but more precisely, how the media chooses to report on them. And first, I need to say that I am truly shocked that this was in 2016. I thought it was in 2019. It feels like it was so recent, but the years are going by quicker these days, it seems. But what do you expect after we spent mostly 2 years at home? So with the disappearance of Sherri Papini, it's a case that I expect most of you will be somewhat familiar with, but to lay out some of the very basic steps. A woman was out jogging in California, and she wasn't a regular jogger, but she was preparing for a 5K run, and she was out for a jog to try and get in shape, and she claimed that she was abducted by two Latina women who were wearing bandanas the entire time across their facial features. They spoke almost entirely in Spanish, but sometimes in English. They held her up at gunpoint. They abducted her and took her to a place where they held her hostage for an extended period of time. A lot of sources have been saying that it was 3 weeks, but just going off of memory, I believe that it was 22 days was the exact amount of time that Sherri Papini was allegedly held captive. And from the beginning, people were thinking that this was a hoax. And I said that I wanted to tie this in to some other true crime cases, and it's going to be my own experience with this type of material, because in 2016 and 17, there were so many channels out there that were talking about how all major true crime cases, whether it was the mass shootings or missing persons cases like the disappearance of Sherri Papini, that these were all hoaxes, that these were all orchestrated by the media, that the general public is being duped and deceived by the media elites because the corporations own the media as well. And it all ties into the New World Order theory. And some of the very same people who were trying to say that all the mass shootings were not real, they were all staged. There was a group of YouTubers out there who would do this anytime there was a mass shooting. Very, very tasteless material. And I don't even want to say this next thing, but I'll say it anyway. There was this guy out there named Alex Jones who may have done that one time, and then that set off a chain reaction for other people who were copycatting his style of always doubting everything, saying that it's an inside job, and then one thing leads to another. It's a domino effect. And anytime there was a mass shooting or any high-profile true crime event, they said that it was a hoax. They said that it was staged, and they provided their reasons. But with the disappearance of Sherri Papini, this woman from California that went missing and was held hostage for 22 days, the people who were being skeptical may have actually made some correct observations. I'll talk about some of these other claims involving the shootings later on, but there's a very large portion of the population that believes that Sherri Papini did indeed stage her own hoax. Now, why would she do this? She was married, she was a mother, she just said she was jogging, training for a 5K run. It seems like everything would be going well in her life, right? Well, to help us out, I would like to go to an article from theindependent.co.uk. Miss Papini told authorities that she had been abducted at gunpoint and held captive by two armed and masked Hispanic women, one in her 20s or 30s and the other between her 40s and 50s. The DNA that was taken from Sherri Papini's clothing was later discovered by investigators in 2017 and would eventually lead to the conclusion that she had run away from home and had not been abducted. The investigation heated up when authorities requested a familial DNA search in 2019, which scours DNA databanks for male relatives of an unknown suspect. The indictment in the case states that in March of 2020, police were notified that a potential male relative of the unknown male in the case, whose DNA was on Miss Papini's clothing, had been identified. That male was related to an ex-boyfriend of Sherri Papini. So that is looking more and more like there is indeed some type of orchestration going on. And I just want to share this last detail. 3 months later, investigators took a bottle of Honest Honey green tea from a trash can outside the ex-boyfriend's apartment in Southern California, and they used that to obtain DNA. And I was listening to the Lord and Arts channel earlier. They do a great show called Case Cracked, which is done by John Lorden and Christy Arnhart. She is very much involved with that, a producer and writer for that program. And they were talking a lot about the disappearance of Sherri Papini and how the boyfriend may have been her entire alibi or her entire safe house rather than an alibi. She spent the entirety of her time in his home, and the details that they were sharing, which was mostly based off of the 50-page affidavit that was released to the police, was that Sherri was behind it all. She was the mastermind. She orchestrated all of this, and the reasons we'll get into later on, but some of the tasks that she required this ex-boyfriend to do were to be putting up wood panels to block out the windows, and also she began cutting off her own hair. He assisted in injuring her, including striking her with a hockey puck in some way. I mean, that's a very odd thing to do. They were even postulating and speculating about, well, did he actually take a hockey stick and hit the puck against her, or did he just pound it with his hand? And even branding her on her shoulder, many things going on. And there, you just have to question the psychology of the people that would be involved with that if those incidents did indeed take place. But about a year ago, Dr. Todd Grande did a video on Sherri Papini's case, and he talked about a very key detail that tipped the authorities off into believing that Sherri Papini had staged her own disappearance, and that was that she had reported that she got into an altercation with one of the Hispanic women who was holding her captive, and that she cut her foot during the altercation, but there was no wound on her foot. There was also no mark from a healing wound. There was absolutely no trace of any such thing, so the authorities began to become very skeptical of the disappearance. And this is where these skeptics that I was talking about on those loudmouth doubt the media channels may have actually come into play, because they questioned the legitimacy of her injuries. It's true that she lost lots of weight, and it's true that she actually did have marks and injuries on her. She was released on Thanksgiving Day of 2016 at approximately 4:30 in the morning. She was witnessed on a security footage camera, and she still had restraints on her. Then after she was picked up by somebody, she was taken to a hospital, and it was deemed that her injuries were non-life-threatening, and she was allowed to leave the hospital later that day. That's what they zone in on, and that's what the skeptics were just shouting it into the YouTube microphones years ago. They were saying, if this woman had actually been held captive for 22 days, then she would not have had such superficial injuries where she would have been able to go home the same day. And I am somebody that really wanted to defend her. I'm somebody that didn't want to just give in to these internet loudmouths who are going buck wild and just saying that everything is false, everything you're seeing on the television is a hoax, no one is telling the truth. I didn't want to believe that, but the more you look at the pieces of evidence in her story, there are giant plot holes, and of course someone can be held captive and still have non-life-threatening injuries. I think that it's absolutely abnormal that she would have been allowed to go home the same day, even based on everything that she said, whether it's experiencing branding, malnourishment, and so on. Back to the article from The Independent. The ex-boyfriend said he helped her create some of the injuries, although he never laid his hands on her directly, and that includes the part where he is striking her with the hockey puck. He told investigators he believed that they might again end up in a relationship. They had previously broken up in 2006, but Miss Papini told him that she missed her kids and wanted to go back home. He then drove her back to Northern California and dropped her off on a rural road where she was later found 150 miles south of Redding with a chain around her waist. Dr. Todd Grande pointed out something that the police had shared, and then he gave his commentary on that exact detail. And I am not extremely familiar with human trafficking cases, but one reason why the authorities began to doubt her story again is if victims are ever released from people who have abducted them, normally they do not leave the restraints on the person. As you heard, there was a chain around her waist, and I believe there were some other things on her hands, and I think actually on her ankles too, she had some other type of restraining device to a certain extent. Just that detail is coming to mind. But they said that is not normally done because that leaves behind evidence that can be traced back to them. And that begs the whole question of why was this disappearance orchestrated in the first place? And the narrative that Sherri Papini was providing is that even though these two Latina women were talking in Spanish almost the entire time, they did share the info that she was going to be sold into human trafficking, she was going to be sold into sexual slavery, and they had a buyer lined up for her, and this buyer was even a member of law enforcement. Several details going on in the story, but also that the news coverage around Sherri Papini's disappearance was monumental. It was monolithic. And I believe on Case Crack, they even said that this was the largest, most widely covered missing persons case of 2016, although I certainly haven't gone back and uh, reviewed those statistics, but it was very popular. It was talked about on primetime television and on the evening news regularly. They would talk about the disappearance of Sherri Papini, and I said that I had trouble believing that it had happened as early as 2016. It really feels like it was much more recent than that. But that's where they began to doubt this whole thing. It was just very abnormal for the captors to release somebody under those conditions. So says they. And they definitely didn't seem like they were professionals who were recruiting people for human trafficking to sell them into slavery, because they're doing all of these things that wouldn't have been typical of the profession. Now, to give my own original commentary on the subject, I think that that is almost a little bit too micro-focused. I mean, let's say hypothetically there actually were two abductors, although it doesn't look very likely now. Hypothetically, if there were two abductors, would they not have been inexperienced? Is that out of the question? I mean, how do they know that they were seasoned professionals who had abducted someone as opposed to people doing it for the first time who weren't as familiar with these types of tactics? So it really seems like the authorities were acting as if they knew too much about what was going on. And a very odd statement that I heard from Christy Arnhart, again, the host of Case Cracked, or producer and writer, I should say, of Case Cracked. It was that, was Sherri Papini recreating all of these injuries, such as chaining herself up in the ex-boyfriend's house, or having the malnourishment and being struck with blunt objects? Was she doing that not only to make it look real, but also so if she could pass a polygraph test later on? And I began to think about that statement for a second, and I thought that was a little bit of an odd thing to say, because my immediate instinct was, at the very least, she would have been able to truly recreate details such as I was chained to a post, or I was struck with a blunt object, I didn't have anything to eat, and they actually said when she arrived at the hospital she only weighed 87 pounds, so that is quite shocking, but it does appear that there are just so many inconsistencies in her story. And you would think, though, if she's going to all this trouble about creating details, why would she make up the detail about cutting her foot when there was no cut on her foot? I mean, that almost seems like it is something that is absolutely unnecessary. And yes, I was about to say shooting yourself in the foot, but I tried to hold back. So, following the arrest of Sherri Papini, as she has been arrested for mail fraud and other crimes, following her arrest, she was released on $120,000 bail, but had to surrender her passport and to agree to mandatory psychiatric treatment. And then she now faces charges of lying to federal agents and defrauding the California Victim Compensation Board of approximately $30,000. Now, I don't believe that that was the primary motive. I do not. Money? Is that why this was done? To get some type of GoFundMe page going, and a lot of people are going to donate, and then she is going to retract all that, and then she's just going to show up like she did. And I believe that it's in addition to that $39,000, there was also a possible donation of $50,000 that was going to be made. An anonymous individual offered $50,000 for the safe return of Sherri Papini, and there was an expiration date on that time, so she was released shortly before the expiration date on the donor's money would have gone through. Was money a factor? Yes, but was that the primary factor? No, I don't believe so, because once Sherri Papini started to resurface in the news, they were talking about how there was this very big habit that she had of habitual lying. This ex-boyfriend who claims that he had helped her do all these things to her body said that she was a habitual liar, manipulator. His was very typical behavior for her. She also had a long history with problematic behavior, unstable behavior. She also had problems with drugs, particularly benzodiazepines. So there's a lot of instability going on. And when they talk about mandatory psychiatric care, I think that that is definitely a bigger motive, her own mental instability, if indeed she did do this. I mean, she has, we don't know everything 100%, but if indeed that's what happened. Now, whether this is connected to Sherri Papini or not, some people have this problematic ability of chronic lying. Not even pathological lying, but just chronic lying, and doing it very frequently. And they have desires and imagination and fantasy, and they just put it all out there. They want to do something, and they do it. And they don't show regard for people in after they have told all their lies, or they spin the web of lies, so to speak. They show no regard for how it is affecting other people. And I do have to suspect that there was some type of underlying psychological condition. Yes, of course, maybe she would have looked to profit for it if she indeed did this. We don't know all the facts yet. But I do have to think that there is something else going on. There are other ways that people could orchestrate something like this. But I would like to give a shout out to People magazine, because their coverage has been all over the news with the Sherri Papini story, and they're just putting out articles here and there. And I never ever really thought that I'd be citing People magazine on this channel, Black Box Online Radio. As always, you can like and subscribe to hear more about true crime cases and anything under the sun and in the darkness. But I would like to read this article that People magazine put out today. What's next for Sherri Papini? The California mom who claimed that she was kidnapped by two Hispanic women in 2016 faces 20 years in prison if convicted for lying about her case. Legal experts are weighing her options. Sherri Papini, the mother of two who ignited a massive search after her husband had reported her missing and kidnapped while jogging near her rural California home in 2016, was charged last week with making up the entire story and released on $120,000 bail. Papini is facing charges of making false statements to a federal officer and mail fraud. She could get up to 20 years in prison if she is convicted. Legal experts doubt that she'll get a long sentence. Most think that she should take a plea bargain that could result into anything from home detention to up to 2 years in prison for her alleged crimes. But when I was reading a different article, I think it was actually one that was put out by People magazine as well. As I said, they have multiple ones. They said that she cannot get off from this. Yes, she might have a problem with chronic lying. She might have had problems with substance abuse in the past, and she might have had problems about overly, excessively manipulating people, but that should not get her off the hook. That does not mean that someone doesn't know right from wrong. That does not mean that someone doesn't have an understanding of the law, and that shows a certain degree of calculation. So that definitely isn't in the category of not guilty by mental disease or defect, and she should be held accountable if she did indeed lie, and that's up for the courtroom proceedings to determine. But the next paragraph is, it's not murder and it's not armed robbery, but those are serious crimes, Los Angeles-based defense attorney David Ring tells People. Either way, Ring believes prosecutors will seek jail time. She misled the public and she created hysteria in that community, thinking that there was a kidnapping. I mean, yes, all of that is true if she did and if she is indeed found guilty. And on Case Crack, they shared some info about how there is an element of racism that gets incorporated into this, and she's saying that these Latina women tortured her by playing weird Mexican music over and over again, and they're like, what do you mean by weird Mexican music? And she said mariachi music. And then she also said that there was something to the effect of they forced her to eat bad Mexican food or something, and I think they're referring to something like a wheat-based product, but don't quote me on that detail. So again, she's just sharing types of far-out stories that could be very insulting to an entire community. And this is still an ongoing story, so I'll definitely be following these developments, and the mainstream media is certainly not backing down from them. But I wanted to talk about some other cases as well, because as I was going through my YouTube journey in 2016 and 17, listening to a bunch of very weird people online, I even began to wonder, why am I listening to people who are just saying weird things? Perhaps it's the concept of how outrageousness can draw a crowd. But in regards to these people who were internet hoaxers, who were just saying that everything is a hoax, one of the shootings rather, that came into play was an incident involving Vester Lee Flanagan. He was the man who shot a woman while she was reporting on television. Vester Lee Flanagan was actually a news anchor as well. He used the name Bryce when he was on the air, but he had a videotape of him shooting the woman, and the hoaxers online were saying that there's no possible way that that man actually committed the shooting, because the hand that you would see aiming the gun at the woman was of a Caucasian male wearing a blue shirt, and the reflection that was captured on one of the surfaces that you could see in the background was of a black man in a black jacket. So obviously this isn't the same person. This is doctored footage. The whole thing is a lie, and that is probably the absolute worst true crime theory that I have heard ever, because what people would do is they would just show the images for a millisecond, and then they would say that, okay, here's the truth, even though they're just like showing you a flash of something. Did you see it? Did you see it? It's like the people who say that they caught Bigfoot, but then Bigfoot runs away, and they're just left with a blurry photograph and some funky-looking shape on the ground. They're calling, yep, that's a Bigfoot track. Yep, that's just what Bigfoot looks here. That blurry thing that you're seeing, that's that mysterious thing that everybody's been looking for. That's exactly what people were doing, except they had the audacity and the nerve to actually do this with true crime cases where people were murdered. I mean, goodness gracious. But very clearly, even if you look at a low-resolution photo of Vester Lee Flanagan in the reflection, you can see very clearly he is wearing a blue shirt. But what's this whole thing about somebody wearing a blue shirt, which is firstly a dark blue shirt, and a jacket? So, do they not know what a jacket is? Is it possible to wear a shirt and a jacket at the same time? I mean, this isn't rocket science here. This isn't splitting the atom. I mean, very clearly, he was wearing a blue shirt that protruded outward and continued. The sleeve went out longer than whatever black thing that he was wearing. No, there's no type of grand conspiracy orchestrated by the New World Order to drive fear into the heart of America. There was a man who was mentally unstable, who committed a very horrible crime, and it is an absolute tragedy that a woman lost her life. And I kid thee not, people would do this all the time. They would say that the Elliot Rodger shooting and Isla Vista are also referred to as the Santa Barbara shooter. He was also framed, and that it was all set up and rigged by the media. And the biggest reason in that one was that there were tarps on the ground at the locations where Elliot Rodgers shot his victims, and they thought, tarps, that must be some type of a camera crew or theatrical set bringing in their equipment. Yeah, right. People would just say really dumb things, but then they would stitch it all together and make it look like there was some type of grand conspiracy going on. They take these little dumb factoids and they just stitch it together with imagination, and they act like everyone's trying to destroy humanity except them. But one of them that I have to be very critical of is something that goes all the way back to the Kennedy assassination. And it relates to a theory that was put forward by an individual named William Cooper, Bill Cooper, a person whom I do respect because Bill Cooper had a lot of insightful statements. But his theory in the JFK assassination was that JFK was actually shot by his limo driver, the person driving the car, that he pulled out a gun and fired backwards and shot JFK in the head. But it's the exact same way of sharing the info. He showed the clip for a single second, and there's this image that you can't tell what it is. And one of the few points where I agree with Mark Jacobson, a critic of William Cooper, is that was not a handgun that was pulled out. That is simply a reflection. That is the sunlight bouncing off of, well, somebody's head, and an object, and that's what is creating that image. There is no gun that was pulled by the driver of the car and fired back into JFK's head. People say ridiculous things with very simple explanations, and they just show you a small second of the footage, and you're like, wait, what did I actually see? Oh, well, what you actually saw was someone trying to lie and deceive you. Sherri Papini is a case, though, where she was most likely the hoaxer herself. She most likely orchestrated that entire thing. And the final point that I would share about her is, why would this ex-boyfriend go along with this? Even though he knows that everything is bad, he knows that perhaps this is going to blow up in his face. Why would anybody go along with that? And I think that it relates to something that I heard on the show Meet, Marry, Murder, which I'll talk about tomorrow. And that is that he was in a vulnerable place, someone who is susceptible to manipulation. And I talk a lot about this on the channel AstroPsych 400 when I talk about frame. Like, I learned the expression framing the conversation, where someone is trying to act like the dominant entity in the conversation, or maybe you're operating within someone else's frame. If they are more controlling than you are, or if you're more controlling than them, then they are operating in your frame. It can be used in somewhat of a malleable way. But maybe she just had a very strong controlling frame around this guy, or perhaps, again, he was just vulnerable, or he was conditioned in some way to go along with her and was unable to say no, or maybe he is an absolute liar and he was a participant in it from the beginning because he wanted a sexual partner. The moral of this story is, and I mean this episode, all the stories covered, is sometimes the conspiracy theorists are wrong and sometimes the conspiracy theorists are right. And I know that sounds like a Captain Obvious statement, but it's not, because so many people are trying to tell you that it's one or the other. Sometimes these far-out wacky theories that people are sharing online turn out to be true. Sometimes people will be talking about a conspiracy theory, and it turns out to be true. Sometimes people are saying something that maybe the general public doesn't want to accept, but then it turns out to be factual, and a lot of people don't want to deal with that. Then on the other hand, there are people who are just looking at little flashes of light, or they're looking at some type of, maybe a shadow on a piece of wood, and they're trying to make you think that it's something that it's not. But anyway, that's all I will share in this episode here. And if you have anything to say at all about the disappearance of Sherri Papini, the shooting committed by Vester Lee Flanagan, William Cooper, and the JFK assassination, anything at all, you can put your ideas in the comments section down below. And if you like this episode, you can hit the like button. Always hit the subscribe button. It really helps out the channel. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. I'm also on Instagram, BlackBoxNed88, and I will see you over there on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.